Hi, my name is Rick Bloodworth. This is the Common Sense Christian channel, and today we're going to be talking about the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is by far one of the most important documents as far as explaining the founding of the United States of America in a way that can be done very quickly and very concisely, but which really an embarrassingly few number of Americans are even familiar with. Most Americans do not learn much about the Declaration of Independence. They may cover it briefly for a day or two, sometime during their schooling from the age of, or from the grades of kindergarten through being seniors in high school. But with rare exceptions, it does not really happen that people get much of an in-depth view of the Declaration of Independence. And there's a reason for that, because many people consider the Declaration of Independence today to be a radical document because it is written against tyrants, and it talks specifically about what the duty and the rights of a free nation are to stand up to tyrannical authority. And as you're probably well familiar with, much of the authority that we have within our own nation today very much borders on the tyrannical, if in fact it doesn't cross over into actually being tyranny. And so I thought it would be good to read from the original Declaration of Independence today. I'm not going to read the whole thing, certainly, but I want to read enough of it to give us a decent perspective of it and a decent overview of it. And I'm going to be reading from a book that's entitled The History of the United States. It's a 4-volume set. This is volume 1. They're pretty good-sized books. And this was written in 1866. This is an original copy of that. And it was just giving the history of the United States from the very earliest of times up to the times of the Revolutionary War, and then certainly continuing on into the Civil War. When this book was written, or at least it was written shortly after that. It was written by a man named J.A. Spencer, Dr. J.A. Spencer. It's really a very well put together history, and it's a history that you're not going to find in a lot of modern day books today. In this particular book is a copy of the Declaration of Independence, and included in that is the original draft of it. The Declaration of Independence that we have, that was actually signed into law, or that was voted on and passed in order to make the original declaration, was edited before it was even completed and before it was signed. And so I'm not just going to read from the edited portion, but I also want to read another part of it that will give you an idea as to at least how some of those who were our founders felt about certain things. But anyway, this is the Declaration of Independence. It starts in this particular book on page 410, and it has 2 columns. One is the original draft, and the other is the approved draft that was actually signed once they agreed on all the different changes within the Declaration of Independence. But here it is. A declaration by the representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled. This is the Continental Congress that they're talking about. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another, and to assume among the powers of earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitles them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. And so the founders were saying this. As they were declaring their independence, they felt like there was some explanation that needed to be given to the rest of the world and to those who would follow to understand what it was that caused them to break these bands of power, to dissolve from the authority of the government of Great Britain and King George. And so it goes on to say this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And this is going to be an important theme of the Declaration of Independence. They want to point out that government comes from the consent of the governed. And anytime the government goes in opposition to the governed, in other words, against their will, then there has to be something done about that. And in this case, obviously, it was a breaking of ties with Great Britain. Goes on to say this: it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to just institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as they shall deem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. And so they go on from there, and in just a short time, they're going to start listing a long line of grievances against Great Britain and against the King of Britain. Included among those grievances are such things as taxation without representation. You can read that in the Declaration of Independence, and I would encourage you to do that. I think too many people are ignorant of things like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. They think that what we're doing in our country right now are things that our founders would have approved of, when in fact many of the things that we're doing right now were the very types of things that caused them to go to the government, to Great Britain, and say, if you don't stop this, we're going to break ties with you because of the tyranny that you're exercising over us. And now in the Declaration of Independence, they're breaking those ties. And so they give a long list of grievances. I believe there's 28 in all, but it's one particular grievance that I want to read to you that was struck out of the original draft. Again, in this column you have the original draft, and in this column you have the draft that they settled on. And in this column it's just kind of interesting because it'll have little comments like this part's not altered or this part was struck out. I want to read a part that was struck out to give you an idea of how some of the founders felt about one of the grievances that they had against Great Britain. And here's what they said. Talking about King George and the government. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating the most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who have never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur intolerable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of the infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian King of Great Britain. In other words, there were many in America who wanted this practice of slavery stopped. And they were pointing out that this king, who called himself a Christian king, was the very reason that slavery was continuing to that day in America. And so they're berating him for that and including this, or they wanted to, many of them, to include this in the offenses. But as you can clearly see from reading the Declaration of Independence, this grievance was struck out. And you can guess which states wanted this grievance struck out. But I wanted to read this again because some of the people, many of our founders, were so opposed to slavery that they considered it one of the reasons that they needed to break ties with Great Britain. And here's what it goes on to say. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he, talking about the king, has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this exorable commerce. And so what they're saying in this is, even though they attempted to pass legislation to do away with the slave trade in America, that the king kept overruling them. Now, let's get back to the rest of the Declaration of Independence. Talking about their conclusions. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of this world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. They are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connections between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace contracts, alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and other things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honors. And then after that, we have the signatures of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence, starting with John Hancock. The second to last signature on the Declaration of Independence is Thomas Jefferson. And included in those signatures are men like Dr. Benjamin Rush, Benjamin Franklin, Samuel Adams, John Adams, and even a preacher by the name of George Witherspoon, who was quite prominent in America at that time and who quite prominently preached against the tyranny that was happening with Great Britain and the unchristian acts with which they were imposing upon America. And so, what are we to take from this? What are we to take from the Declaration of Independence? First and foremost, let me emphasize this. I'm not suggesting that we have another Declaration of Independence from our government. What I am suggesting, though, is an understanding that there comes a point where people have to make a decision whether they're going to be obedient to tyrannical rulers or whether they are going to become obedient to their own consciences as far as their serving of God. Within the Declaration of Independence was a statement to this effect. They said that people will put up with these types of grievances for a long time, perhaps longer than they ought to, in order to continue the bands of unity. But there comes a point where you've just taken too much and you can no longer put up with the injustices that are being suffered, because so often these injustices are being done against the innocent, and the righteous have an obligation to stand up for the innocent. Well, again, I think it's really important that we understand our history. I think it's important that we read books like this so that we know not only what the Declaration of Independence says, but that we also know what a great number of our founding fathers felt about issues, important issues to them, such as slavery. A lot of times within our schools today, we're taught that it was just a bunch of evil white slaveholders. What they don't talk about is how many of these people were trying to do away with slavery. They had passed legislation to do away with slavery before the Declaration of Independence was signed, and this legislation was ignored by King George in Great Britain. We understand the problems that we had amongst our own numbers with slavery and other issues as well. Maybe a good example of disagreements in modern times would be the issue of abortion. There are some of us who are absolutely appalled at abortion. We are convinced that this within the womb is a human life. We have government financing, which means they're taking our tax dollars and using them to perform such heinous acts as partial birth abortion, where a baby coming to the point of delivery is brutally murdered within the womb, and part of that is funded by our tax dollars. There are other people who say, no, a woman has a right to choose what she's going to do with her own body, even if that includes a 9-month-old fetus, by their judgment, being terminated. And so you can see, just like the issue of slavery during their time was certainly a divisive issue, and they had to come to terms with that as they were breaking off their alliance with Great Britain and coming out from under their authority, there may come a point where someday we have to make such a determination as well on serious issues that really do have great consequences. And again, just as they pointed out that most men will put up with a lot of things that perhaps they shouldn't be putting up with for a long time, there does come a point where they just have to make a break. They have to make a stand. Benjamin Franklin, when they were about to sign this Declaration of Independence, pointed out that they were all going to, as they were signing this declaration, they were going to have to hang together or they would surely hang separately. And his point was they were going to have to be committed now to a war and supporting one another, as they mentioned, with their lives and with their sacred honor, or they were going to be ended up being hunted down separately and hung separately. And many of the original patriots were hung separately. It was a brutal time. It was a difficult decision. The question I have for you is, why don't we teach this in our schools anymore? Or if we do teach it, why do we teach it with such a slant to it that we give people the impression that our founding fathers were just a bunch of evil people who wanted to come here so that they could enslave other people? We have to start using the intelligence that God has given to us. These men recognized the fact that it was God whom they were accountable to in the end. It was God to whom they were relying on for protection through this struggle that was certainly going to happen as a result of their Declaration of Independence. War had already started. Britain had already started committing brutal acts against America. There were already many of the colonies and the colonists who had been attacked and colonists who had been killed. And so they had to finally take a stand, because they realized if they didn't take a stand, they were either effectively going to become slaves themselves, or they were going to be separated and killed for the audacity of standing up against a king, a tyrant. Well, the idea of tyranny is this: it's an unjustified power. We see in America that we have elections. They're to be free and fair elections. But you have to admit that most people in America, regardless of what their political affiliation is, do not feel like our elections are free or fair. We can be pretty certain with this election that's coming up this fall that whoever loses is going to claim that the other side cheated. And they may be right, who knows? But when you lose such trust within your government, and when you find that your government comes to the point where they're actually waging war against its citizens, we have to figure out what we're going to do. As Christians, we have to figure out what our responsibility to God is. One of the things in the Declaration of Independence that they pointed out was that King George was effectively waging war against the colonies. And you look at some of the things that are going on in our nation today with our borders being open and people being allowed to come in, and not only allowed, but many of them are being flown in by our government into various airports around America in the middle of the night, just dropping off these illegals to go out into society and to do whatever they want to do. There are some of us who consider this to be an act of war. We consider this to be an act of tyranny. What are we going to do? Well, first and foremost, I believe we need to be doing this. We need to recognize that America has been involved with such great crimes of sin against God that we need repentance. That means before you and I can do anything, we need to be praying to God and asking Him to forgive us for the things that we've taken part in. Because surely we, by sometimes just our silence and not speaking up against things that are clearly wrong, have actually encouraged wrong things to continue. And what that has eventuated in is a tyrannical government. Remember, during their time, they said people not only had the right, but they had the duty to rebel against tyrants. Well, that's a personal decision, isn't it? And I'm not suggesting that we rebel, but what I am suggesting is we do have many tyrants that are now ruling over us. This taxation without representation is certainly something that's happening more and more. We have a lot of people who are crossing the border for the specific intent of those who are aiding and abetting them to vote them into power so that they can raise taxes against us. That in a way is very much a taxation without representation, because when people who do not have the right to vote are actually helping put people into power in order to tax us in ways that we do not approve, well, that's taxation without representation. Again, it's an act of war in the eyes of many to allow people to come over and commit illegal acts within America. And make no mistake, it is illegal. When they're coming in illegally, they're criminals. And the fact that we have so many within our government that are aiding and abetting this, that are not only allowing it and turning a blind eye to it, but in many cases they are providing transportation for them to come over. We're in a mess in America. And I believe we're in that mess because of our own sin. And I believe first and foremost we have to repent of that sin. Then we need to be praying for wisdom. And we need to be coming to a decision. We need to be coming to a point where we realize that we can no longer just overlook offenses without at least saying something about it. These are important things. It's not a light subject, I realize today. But I would encourage you to start getting back to your roots. First of all, your roots as a child of God. Read the Bible every day. Become familiar with what the New Testament says and what your responsibilities are. And then start reading your own history. If you're an American, these are going to include documents and times such as the Declaration of Independence and the times in which it was written, the Constitution of the United States and the times in which it was written, as well as the events that have occurred in our nation through the years, some of which have been incredibly honorable, and some of which we have to admit are nothing but despicable. And once we become familiar with who we are and where we came from, then we have to determine from the Scriptures what our duty is. It's personal between you and God. That's not something for any man to tell you what you need to be doing. But we do need to be thinking about it, because it's God who has told us that we have certain responsibilities in life. And I believe one of those responsibilities in a free nation is to take righteous stands and to say what needs to be said, even if it marks you as somewhat of a target for having taken a stand and for saying things that need to be said. I believe this nation can be saved. I believe this nation can be won back over without some sort of a war or turmoil. But I do know that we're going to be held accountable if we keep going down this reckless path that we've been going on. And I'll say this in conclusion. Our children are going to be doomed either to slavery or to a civil war if we do not start taking righteous stands now. So, find out who you are, where you come from, read the Bible, read your history, and then make the best conclusion that you can, and then make the most loving and firm stand that you can make. That's it for today. I hope this gives you something to think about. I hope it doesn't distress you, but I hope it does help to get across the seriousness of our circumstances today and the need for us to become an educated people as to who we are and where we came from. Thank you for listening today. I hope that you'll come back and listen to more videos after this. But more than anything else, I pray that God will richly bless you as you seek His will and you seek to do your best to serve Him in the best and most loving way possible. God bless.